the question that we always say is that if power falls on the streets, what will happen if we are not very organized to that? So I believe that the studies you have done, Vincent, I'm happy to have gotten this copy of the book because I really want to study it properly, is that we shall be able to compare from even Bangladesh, Tunisia, Egypt, Senegal, remember Yanamal and anywhere. And even in DRC Congo, we have never really been able to guide young people to take over the political reins of power. And this is exactly what we should be able to do. The only question is that how are people organized?
All right, thank you so much, everyone who made it to this event to discuss protests in Kenya, protests abroad, what change they've been able to bring about, what change they're incapable of bringing, and what mass mobilization means as we move forward in the world. And things are changing very rapidly in the world. When I prepared for this conversation, Iran, US, and Israel were actively at war. As of this morning, it seems not so much, but we're not very sure about that. So there's just so many moving pieces. The world is moving so fast, and things are changing so fast. And in all of this, we have never seen young people be more activated around the world. Young people still remain the biggest part of the global population, especially in global south countries such as Kenya. They are more educated than any other generation in history. They are more connected through social media, digital platforms, and so on and so forth. And so they are, in very many ways, all of these pieces coming together. And they're more, they live lives of more economic precarity than most generations before them. So all these things come together to create a sort of like a cauldron in which there's so much youthful energy that has no productive place to go. And so we have seen a lot of protests across the world and in our country as well over the last couple of years. I am joined today by Vincent Bevins, who is, it's weird for me to call you an American journalist, given how little time you actually spend in America, but an American journalist who has written 2 amazing books, If We Burn, which you can see, we're holding right here, and it's about protests over the last 2 decades, and the Jakarta method, which is exploration of the Cold War tactics used to repress communist movements across the world, and especially in Indonesia. And we are also joined by Njuki Githethwa, who is very many things. He's a patron of the left in Kenya. He is one of the would you call yourself a board member of Ukombozi Library? Yes, okay, Ukombozi Library. He's the founder of Mashujaa Archives, which I would encourage everybody to visit. Both of these projects are they're projects of archiving the history of struggle in this country, and I'd encourage everyone here to engage with those resources. So today we're going to be talking about protests. We're going to be talking about the changing situation in Kenya, and when I do invite you to speak, please feel free to fill in any part of your intro that I did not do in my introduction. So we'll start with you, Vincent. And obviously, I'm hoping a lot of people here actually watched the episode I did with you now about 1.5 years ago, and that was right in the heart of like the 2024 Gen Z protests. But this is a very different time. But tell us a little bit about your book, a sort of like synopsis. What is it about? What are your findings about protests? And we'll carry on from there.
Sure. Thank you so much for inviting me and for welcoming me here in Nairobi. I'm happy to do a very short summary of what this book is and where it came from. The reason I'm here actually is because I don't know anything about the Kenyan political situation. I've been watching what happened since 2024, thinking it may or may not have some connection to the work that I did in this book. And I, took advantage of an opportunity to come here very quickly and meet some people and try to learn what I can. So I'm looking forward to hearing what you think or what other people think is relevant to the protests of the 2010s that I look at, and looking forward to trying to hopefully hear from somebody that I can work with here to write something for this little publication that I have going about on the upcoming 2-year anniversary of 2024. But yes, absolutely. This book, If We Burn, is an attempt to write a history of the world from 2010 to 2020, focusing on mass protests that either overthrew governments or fundamentally destabilized existing societies and forced some kind of fundamental change. The subtitle here is The Mass Protest Decade and the Missing Revolution, which gives away some of what the conclusions that many protesters came to at the end of that decade. But two elements that are salient are that number one, as far as we know, the people that think that they can count these things came to the conclusion that more people took part in mass protests from 2010 to 2020 than at any other point in previous human history, surpassing the previous record of the 1960s. We'll see if the 2020s end up breaking that record. But if you went back to countries that experienced unexpected explosive mass protests in that decade, and for the research on the book, I did something like 250 interviews in 12 countries and asked them, what did you get as a result of the mass protests? In no case would somebody say that we carried out a revolution. In many cases, people say that they did not accomplish much. In some cases, there are tragic cases of reversals. So I went around the world asking people that had lived through this, what happened? What did you try to achieve? What did you achieve? What did you wish had gone differently? And what do you think that you learned from your experiences in that decade? So very briefly, as I conceived of it, we dealt with uprisings starting in Tunisia and then spreading to Egypt and the rest of North Africa and then in West Asia. We go through Ukraine, which ultimately leads to this horrible war we're still living through. We deal with Brazil, a case which I lived through very closely, ending with Chile in 2019. But there's 10 to 12 cases that I look at. Now, the book tries to in some way describe what happened in each case. I won't try to do that now to try to finish this quick summary of what the book does. I will say that a framework emerged for interpreting what did or did not happen in each particular country. And that what emerged is that in this decade, starting especially with Tunisia and then the globally significant model inspiration of Tahrir Square in Egypt, a particular way to respond to elite injustice, a particular way of taking action to contest abuses committed by the states or the ruling class of a given country became hegemonic. It became something that we started to see more and more. We saw some cases inspire other cases, but a particular style of revolt became very commonplace, often even seeming to become, for some actors, the natural or the only way to carry out a revolt. And that form, that repertoire of contention in the sociological language, that recipe of tactics was the apparently spontaneous, leaderless, digitally coordinated, horizontally structured mass protest that took place in either public squares or public spaces. And each one of those ingredients came from somewhere and has its material and ideological prehistory, but each one of those elements combined in a very powerful way in the 2010s. There are, as I say, ideological reasons for the emergence of this repertoire, of this style of revolt, but I think there are also deep material reasons. We live in an era characterized by precarious and atomized individuals, people who work often for themselves, if they can get any work at all. The type of organizing that seemed very natural in the 20th century is very difficult to do. And the easiest thing to put together seems to have been, in the 2010s, a rapidly assembled mass of individuals coming together without having really planned to do so, around a set of reactions to government abuses that exploded very quickly. Now, what happens in the 2010s, at least, is not that this form does not work. In the long history of human revolts against elites, there are lots of stories of things that don't really work. That would be uninteresting and also somehow less perplexing than what actually did happen in the 2010s. What happened is that this combination, this particular repertoire of contention, this recipe worked far better than even the original organizers of many of these protests had ever imagined. This explosive accumulation of humanity in the streets that had not been planned 2 days before and hadn't even been conceived as possible as some of the original organizers, succeeded in generating the kind of quantitative increase on the streets that actually overthrew governments, or in other cases forced governments to make concessions because they realized that things cannot go on. Life as usual has come to a halt. But what happens as a result of these very real opportunities created by the quantitative increase that is the explosive, unexpected, apparently spontaneous mass revolt, in each of the cases that I looked at in the 2010s, it is not actually the revolt that takes advantage of those opportunities. It is always some other actor. In the cases where there is a dictator, for example, fleeing the country, jumps on a plane and has to leave, there is a power vacuum that is filled by somebody. And in a world dominated by an imperialist system, sometimes that somebody is a foreign actor that takes advantage of what they see as an opportunity. They rush in to fill that power vacuum. Sometimes it is local elites. Sometimes it is the military. Sometimes it is right-wing elites. Sometimes it is some other aspect, some other part of the political class that has been waiting in the wings or has been out of power for a few years and is able to take advantage of that power vacuum. In some cases, and this is the case where some of the protesters say that things got a little bit better, it is movements that are somehow more or less aligned with the people on the streets, that somehow can make a credible claim to say, oh, yes, we understand what you're asking for and we stand for you. But in no cases in the 2010s was it actually the streets, the people, that took advantage of the opportunities that they themselves created with the risk that they took, sometimes the lives that they lost, with the courage that they showed. It was always somebody else that took advantage of the opportunities created. And an easy way of, as I say, a framework for understanding the story, because each story is different, is if the people that took advantage of those opportunities were the enemies of the protesters, then this is experienced as profound defeat and failure. If they were somehow or another their allies or friends or people that they saw as on their side politically, then this could be seen as a moderate success. But there was no case in which there was the deep kind of a structural change that would be called a revolution by these protesters. In less pronounced cases, when there is not an actual power vacuum, for example, the dictator does not jump on a plane and leave the country, but a political class realizes they must negotiate somehow. Often what happens is, in a moment of apparent or concrete leaderlessness, leaders are selected either by the existing political class or by the media to forge some kind of a negotiation which is rejected by the people who are on the streets in the first place, but the political class can say, oh, we've created a negotiation, we've created some kind of an exit ramp, we've listened to the streets, it's over. And when that doesn't work, if that is not accepted by the streets, they simply opt for repression. And this is another case that we've seen. So, to end that attempt at a quick summary, what people told me as an answer to that last question, how do you wish things that had gone differently in the 2010s, what do you think you had learned from that? The answer that I heard most often across the 12 countries that I looked at in the last decade was, we wish we had been more organized before the unexpected revolt, the unexpected explosion came. We do think that this form, however imperfect and however weird it is, of the leaderless, horizontally structured, unexpected mass revolt can force changes, but it can only force changes that are truly transformative and that we believe can make society better for us when they exist in coordination with some kind of an ecology of organizations which can take advantage of those opportunities and truly speak for the people that are on the streets, not just say that they're speaking for the people on the streets. So I was talking about this book in 2024 in Brazil with, as it happens, a Kenyan, when things exploded here. And ever since, I've been wanting to understand more what did happen, what it was the streets were asking for, what was achieved, and what could be achieved in the long term. And I guess that's what I hope to hear from you and everybody else tonight.
Great, thank you so much. So now Wanjira, who we had been waiting for, is here. But instead of kicking away Njuki, who offered to be here with us, I think he's going to make amazing additions to this. So Wanjira, I'll just invite you to pull up a seat and just be one of us up here. And as you organize yourself, I'll direct my next question to Njuki. So Njuki, one of the benefits of having you here is that you actually understand the whole history of the struggle in Kenya from the colonial times and beyond. And you were such a core part of the organizing for the protests in 2024 and 2025. So I'd say within the framework that Vincent introduces in his book, there's a lot about what happened in 2024 and 2025 that resonates completely. We had very spontaneously occurring protests and a level of mass mobilization we have never seen in this country. And ostensibly, it was leaderless, partyless, tribeless. And in the mold of the final example you gave of a case where the leader doesn't leave because the leader did not leave, the media did choose its leaders. We're very happy to have one here right now. But there wasn't much in the way of negotiation, but instead what we got was a lot of repression. So I suppose my question to you would be, tell us about the 2024 protests from your experience, and what went wrong, what went right, what went wrong, what do you think yielded, and in what ways does that depart from the deep, deep desires Kenyans have held for a long time for a revolution?
Yeah, thank you, Mamka. I can be heard. And thank you so much for even looping you in a very short while. I will just came as a participant, and I'll still return to my seats once I finish what and give time for Wanjira to contribute. But I will start by saying that there are two ideas which emerge sometimes when you look at protests. There is the idea of protests as waves which comes sometimes from nowhere. It's a build-up. It's like the waves you find in the sea. They up and down, and they recede back and they go. There's that kind of ideas of uprisings that are seen as waves and momentarily they come and disappear. But also there is one other idea which I like so much, of uprisings and movements as phases of what has been there before. For example, you will find that in the Kenyan protest 2024, 2025 going forward, there was a lot of talk in the streets that you have the new Mau Mau. Why was that talk in the street of the Mau Mau? Because they could be able to talk about the issues that the Mau Mau were talking about. So there is a historical connection that you find in the protest that people sometimes think that we miss, but they are always there. But once you look also that in terms of generations, the 2024 uprisings for the young people, and I prefer to call them the youth, because even if it was led by the Gen Zs, there was a lot of mix of young people, the millennials, one or other people from other generations, but mainly from the millennials and the Gen Zs. But one thing that you will not miss from a careful observer of Kenyan protest history is that this is a generational uprising, just like the generations did when they were demanding for multi-party. For example, there were massive protests when Kenyans were demanding for multi-party. And these also were set up by young people who were unknown, and they went to the streets, and some of them died, even claiming for multi-party. But the only difference is that whereas the multi-party agitation was led by some figures in civil society, some of them prominent, and politicians, in these ones, there were no discernible leaders. You could say these are leader of this protest. So there was all that talk about the leaderless, the partyless, and even the tribeless and all those other words. So this has no visible actors that you could say that they were there. But it was the same uprising that you find within, historically, from the Mau Mau You find from the DTM Wa Kenya and many other things that came from the NCC protests that were there before. You will find them before. But the only thing I agree so much is that the protests in Kenya, but also in Africa, you look at what happened in South Sudan, you look at what happened elsewhere, in Tunisia, the Egypt itself, and elsewhere. The protests, the people who die and the people who are suppressed by protest, they don't take normally the leadership. There's always some players, the elite, who are bargained for by the system and foreign powers. And the money class, for example, in Kenya, the ruling class, there are some people who they champion take over the power from the mass protest. And this is not new, because even you remember in Kenyan history, the Mau Mau themselves, when they killed Kimathi and other people, there was no one to take power. The person who was groomed to take over power in Kenya was Kenyatta and his cabo of Home Guards, who in fact when they went to prison, when the person who was sent to go to Kapengure to talk to Kenyatta, he sent him questions to see whether they will be able to destabilize status quo for the British government. So he didn't want people like Kagia or people like Jomo Kenyatta or even Pio Gama Pinto, who was avowedly Marxist. So he was prepared. The same thing happened in this protest. That once young people went, mass protests erupted spontaneously. The people and the ruling class which took over power was the class that was not right in the streets, and they took over power. And this time we talk about the Azimio and other people, Raila Odinga, other people took over power, appointments to the cabinet, and that diffused the entire protest even to date. And those are the things that are very important for us to be able to see. How are the social actors, the movements, the political players, how are they organized to take over the spoils of power? The question that we always say is that if power falls on the streets, what will happen if we are not very organized to that? So I believe that the studies you have done, Vincent, I'm happy to have gotten this copy of the book, because I really want to study it properly, is that we shall be able to compare from even Bangladesh, Tunisia, Egypt, Senegal, remember Yanamal, and anywhere. And even in DRC Congo, we have never really been able to guide young people to take over the political reins of power. And this is exactly what we should be able to do. The only question is that how are people organized? Maybe for now I'll say that, and then later. Thank you.
Great. So Wanjira, I think this brings us to a very natural point of discussion that I think you're best placed to respond to. So a lot of Kenyans now know your face because you were such a prominent figure during the Gen Z protests. And sorry. Yes, great, thanks. So you are a very prominent, face, and a lot of people may not know that you actually have an organizing background. Now, the question I want to come to you with is multi-part. So in the last episode I did for the podcast with David Hundeyin, who is a Nigerian journalist, one of the things he talked about was his sort of like political awakening. So he says he was part of the NSAS protests in Nigeria, and he remembers going to the streets and feeling the energy on the streets and feeling, coming back home every day feeling like, I have done something important. And when all of it was done, and even though, SARS was disbanded, all of the things that were, all the concessions that were made by power to sort of end that protest re-emerged. Those very structures re-emerged in other parts of society in other ways. And that's something very similar to what we experienced here, where a lot of the Finance Bill 2024 that people were opposing was reintroduced. Very many bits of it were reintroduced as acts of parliament, as policies, and so on. And so he says that he realized that he went to the streets opposing the wrong thing, opposing an entity that is so far below in the structure of everything that is going wrong that he took it upon himself to start studying and to understand the players, the puppeteers who are creating the systems within which those changes can or cannot be made. Now, in Kenya, right now there's a lot of organizing. The spirit of young people did not die on the streets. There's so much activism that is still happening, and a lot of it is now directed towards the 2027 election. There's a strong compulsion to change the regime. Ruto must go, Niko Kadi. However, do you feel, despite the fact that young people took this opportunity to read the Constitution back and forth, do you feel that they truly understand the forces of capital, the forces of imperialism, the forces that go far beyond Ruto, the forces that ensure that even if you remove Ruto and replace him with someone else, you're likely going to end up with the same outcomes? Do they understand that? Or are we stopping at that? And what is the work that is being done, especially within the movement space, of which you're one of the leaders? What is being done to make sure that young Kenyans understand some of these forces better so that they're better organized for next time?
Wow. Thank you, Mamka, for having me. And guys, I don't know why I read 6 on the poster, which is why I showed up here at 6. I'm so sorry. But to answer your question, even the event of 25th June is an event people have been organizing towards. It was not a spontaneous event that just happened, that young people just went to the streets and said no to the finance bill. There has been a lot of organizing from the various community justice centers that are in the country, from various political parties and social movements like the Maandamano la Mapinduzi, the Revolutionary Socialist League, the Women in Justice Centers, the Social Justice Centers movement. So, and there have been other protests that led to that major protest. I think the fact that our country has had a very active civic space enabled that moment to come. But even I felt like the author of Nigeria, like, fine guys, we've really scared these guys, we've terrorized them, we've flown them out of the country, but 5 months down the line, it's still the same. It's like we didn't do anything, it's still the same. And I get to understand that it is because we're not building alternative systems that have the same autonomy, if not even more, that could replace the existing dying empires. Because I feel like, as Gramsci said, the old world is dying. If there has ever been a time where the old world is dying and the new is struggling to be born, it really is now. But then Gramsci also adds that now is the time for monsters, which we are seeing. We are going to see a lot more repression, a lot more militarization, a lot more shrinking of the civic space. And it is now upon us to claim these spaces by rebuilding intentionally systems from the grassroots to up that are going to give us the autonomy that we need to birth a new republic. Now, in terms of what is being done towards that, what are the efforts that are being done towards that? There's the campaign, a nationwide campaign for Tuko Kadi that is currently ongoing. I think it is not just about rallying young people to take a vote. We know that elections are not necessarily. For us, we are using it as an avenue for structuring the movement. When we were on the streets, it was very organic and amorphous. It was not consolidated. So for me and for organizers of Tuko Kadi, it's a perfect opportunity to finally create a national structure through this campaign that is going to run towards the elections of 2027. And I think there are also conversations about what if our preferred candidate, you know how election has been in our country, it's always been contested. So there are conversations about what then does the movement do? And also thinking about it long term, that fine, we're going to run an election in 2027. But we know that change and dismantling the system that has been there since independence is going to take a long while. So we feel like we're putting the mechanisms for that now that we are the generation that has had hundreds of our comrades murdered in the streets of Nairobi for demanding a better country. So we feel a sense of responsibility in actualizing that better republic. So we are constantly studying. I feel like this book will be a very good use to us to see what other movements have done, what has happened after protesting, and in terms of consolidating themselves towards really just building alternative systems. Like it's so clear that what we need, also, we're still as angry, we're still as mad. I personally feel like I am more angry than I was in 2024 when we were going for the protests, because these guys have they've made it worse. Like, it's like Kenyans did not speak. There's also an aspect of the protest that I think it's important for us to see. The aspect of anti-imperialism was very present during the finance bill protests. People were very clear that it is IMF and World Bank that is the enemy of our economy, and that has been there historically. So there was a lot of, I remember there was one poster by Comrade Davis that read that Ruto is IMF village elder. There were direct attacks at the representatives of IMF and World Bank. So there is a growing political consciousness that our presidents are mere village elders. There's a whole system that needs to be brought down. And there are conversations about that, political education especially. There's a curriculum being developed that's going to be shared nationwide. What we're learning in Nairobi is what guys in Kisumu and Turkana will be learning. So we are actively in that process of really conscientizing our people towards birthing a new republic.
Great. Well, let me come back to you, Vincent. And this is the era of conspiracy theorists. So let's entertain a conspiracy theory. It seems to me, so you must be aware of the Simon Critchley's framework of the infinitely demanding left that that the left has organized around grievance politics, and it has constructed itself as a very effective machine of constantly asking for change, constantly complaining, constantly opposing, but rarely ever constructing an alternative vision of a future, and that states have learned how to sort of contain that in a sort of contained or controlled opposition, where they allow people to just show up and vent and then feel like they've done something, and then life goes on. Because that part of David Hondane's account of his engagement with NSAS really struck me, that you go home after the protest feeling like you've done something, and yet the world remains the same, and yet all the anger, all the rage that young Kenyans have been feeling has been somehow sublimated by the fact of them being allowed to be on the street. As much as there was every show was made to sort of resist that. However, it was a very effective way of making sure that they go back to their homes and they continue to let the system do what the system does. What is the likelihood that across different countries, across different continents, across different political, social, cultural environments, there would be spontaneous uprisings, all of them leaderless, all of them horizontal, all of them very unlikely to yield the outcomes that brought those people to the streets, all of them setting up the stage, at best, for continued repression? Is that likely, or is this just capitalism's violence being sort of evolving into a very effective way of suppressing dissent at a time when, I saw a post today on Twitter saying something like, people have never been poorer, like equality has never looked like this in the history of humanity. And yet there's very little pushback to that. So what would you say about that?
I would say if there has been a conspiracy, and I think that there has been, carried out by the ruling class over the last 40 years, it is not to incite apparently spontaneous revolts. It is to separate us from each other and to render us disorganized and precarious and individualized. That was part of the intentional project of neoliberalism. And some of its more famous and eloquent exponents will have said this very, very openly. No, we want people that are not in unions. There is no such thing as society. You want people separated from each other. We want it so that people cannot organize in the workplace. We want it so that people are not organized socially and politically. So the intentional creation of a field of quote unquote civil society, which is often in many parts of the world now just really means foreign funded NGOs. But a concrete civil society which consists of atomized, individualized people, that was intentional, right? And that creates a situation in which when there are revolts, which I believe that usually the ruling class does not want. They often are surprised or overtaken, and when they grow far, far more quickly than anybody imagines, they can be really dangerous for the reproduction of the accumulation of capital. But a society which is atomized, disorganized, individualized, and precarious, when it finds itself in a moment of revolt, it often finds itself less capable to truly threaten the interests of a ruling class than it would have been under different circumstances. And I do think that that was something that was desired by various elites over the last 40 years, and this has been a successful project, right? And it's very difficult, and we can recognize that it is true, that it was successful without having easy answers as to how to resolve it. What I would say is two things quickly in addition to that. I thank you, Wanjira, for reminding me of something that we actually spoke about yesterday. The reason I said, I think, like 4 times, apparently spontaneous, is that I don't believe, and I'm not the only person to, I'm taking this view from theorists on the left, there's no such thing, I don't believe, as actual spontaneity. Spontaneity, you have apparent spontaneity, but if you look closely, you will always find that there were people organizing behind the scenes for a long time before the explosion, which came very quickly. What has been happening since 2010, more or less, is a lot of people joining very quickly that had not planned to do so several days before. But even if you look at the person that is maybe like, let's think of the stereotypical 20-year-old that had no political engagements 2 days before, and then they're on the street, you can still watch their lives where a friend of theirs will send them a video and they'll talk about it and they'll decide, oh, I'm going to go out. The spontaneity it tends to be more of a media phenomenon than concrete historical reality. But what I'll say finally in terms of what you describe as possible conspiracies is that if what we get as a result of a particular style of revolt is basically a big button which just is labeled destabilization, what we have seen is some of the most powerful nations on the planet hoping that that happens in other countries, knowing that at best for, let's say, Hong Kong 2019. Hong Kong 2019 is a case where I did speak to a lot of the people that had participated or had some hopes in this, but it was very, very clear that the United States was supporting this because they wanted, somehow or another, just to kind of screw with Beijing. And did the United States think that this would actually lead to a good outcome for the people of Hong Kong? They didn't care. What they wanted was to make Beijing look bad. They wanted just to mess with their enemies. So what you do see is powers pressing this button in the countries that they want to destroy because they believe that there'll be either some kind of a destabilization or some kind of a weakening of the country, but nothing that will be really dangerous to global capital. There seems to have been that kind of belief within the State Department from, let's say, 2009 to 2014, that supporting this kind of a thing in some other country, you don't want it in your own country because that's going to be difficult to deal with, but pressing that button in some other country will be useful if you're just trying to kind of mess things up. But as I say, to summarize, I think that the conspiracy, and it wasn't really a secret, was to disorganize civil society to make it easier for capital to, for the accumulation of capital, and for the easy governance of populations all over the world.
Yeah. Well, be that as it may, we find ourselves, as Wanjira has said quite succinctly, that we find ourselves in the era of monsters, and we've been watching with trepidation, but also with a bit of a sense of hope, especially for those of us in the global south and in Africa, as we watch the sort of contestation for power that's happening between the powerful countries in the world. The theater for that right now being the Middle East, and there's a lot of thinking that's happening around what opportunities there are for countries such as ours, for organizers such as ourselves, in a context of a changing world. If the United States indeed does lose its hegemonic position atop empire, if there's a sort of multipolarity that emerges from that, there's a lot of contestation about whether or not we're entering a multipolar world. I find it very hard to argue that we're not. But in all of this, there's so many of the structures that have kept us trapped that are going to be breaking. there's so much opportunity for us to organize, but there's also a lot of danger that if we don't organize in time, we end up in a place far, far, far worse than where we have come from. I do think that there's every possibility we end up under a second round of colonization by a different set of actors. But Njuki, tell me what you think, what you have been thinking as you've been watching the Iran situation unfold, especially as one of the leaders of organizing in Kenya. What is your thinking about how to take advantage of this moment? How to stick a thingy in the wedge and open up an opportunity for Kenyans to actually reclaim their country and for the continent to reclaim itself.
Thank you, Mamka. I will first reiterate what the two comments I've said here, that I'm also one of those people who don't believe in spontaneity really so strongly. I also don't believe in the new ideas which comes in terms of leaderless movements. Even when you look at the protests, for example, in Kenya, in Sudan, in elsewhere, there are people who are producing flyers. They are producing people who are producing agenda of what will happen. There are some people who are organizing the X-spaces and many other things. Protests sometimes happen. Of course, there were masses of people who went to the streets for the first time, mobilized by others. So that idea of mass protest and spontaneity, I think historically it has been disabused. But also one of the things also which has been disabused so much historically is that sometimes grievances don't necessarily drive the revolution. You can be having a lot of grievances in terms of basic needs, you are poor, and many other things. But that grievances itself is not a powder keg of the revolution. There must be something bigger that will drive you to a revolution. And sometimes what drives people to a big revolution is a sense of hope that if we do these things, life will be better. And that is very key in terms of the revolution. But also another things, and which this was seen also in the Mau Mau, in the toppling of Bangladesh regime and elsewhere, and even in the Gen Z protest. There must be something we call a point of no return, a do or die thing, that if you don't do these things, we shall all be doomed. For example, the young people are feeling in this country that if the finance bill passed, their life will be doomed. That mere fact that they had a central thing that was uniting people without even so much thinking so much about it. And it begins from the heart. That's central. Yeah, so I was saying that there must be such central issue that brings people together. But another point, and this is a life or death issue that we talked about, but I also don't believe that a revolution fails. There are some people who feel when they don't take state power that there is an element of frustrations, an element of despair, an element of giving up. But I don't believe that a revolution fails. I remember that even the last elections that we had, I've been a keen observer of elections mainly from East Africa, within Suluhu's government and also Museveni. But I joined a conversation within the guys, the Uganda elections, which Bobi Wine was central. But one of the questions I asked is that because there was all optimism that Bobi Wine will win the elections, but sometimes elections are not won because it's just, but because you've got machineries of stealing, and you'll manipulate stuff, you'll bribe people, and you'll win. So you might be very popular, but you will lose within what you call the ballot revolution. So I ask the questions: what would happen in the eventuality that you lose the elections? Because I think for us, we are so focused on state power, the elections, that sometimes when we don't win, we lose, and we find that the revolution is over. But there is one thing I always believe in, is that there could be two processes of revolution. One of them is liberating spaces, sites of struggle. But also there's the eventual one, which is transforming the systems that are the structural revolution. The structural revolution is fine. It can come to the ballot revolution. But there is this creating what Gramsci called the hegemony. That's the civil society, the people will be able to seize control of spaces that they can be able to have as their own revolution. And this kind of liberated zones is not even new in terms of revolution. You'll find them even in terms of Michael Cabral. You'll find them in Mao Zedong. You'll find many other, all of them, they are liberated zones that they were able to occupy. So if us, we are focused so much on the revolution and the ballot revolution, but we don't want to secure the bases we have been able to conquer. And this is what Ngogwa called securing the base. If we don't secure those bases we've been able to conquer, we shall always be able to give the impression of our people that we have lost. And when you give the impression of our people that we have lost, there is a sense of despair, there's a sense of frustrations. I think we should be able to ennoble ourselves and to be able to be happy that there are some areas in this country that we have liberated. For example, today's government runs scared. You can even see the finance bill is not publicized. They are doing it bits and pieces, simply because they could see there is anger. So in terms of the battle of ideas, the Gen Zs and the protests and the civil society, they have won that battle of ideas. In terms of being listened to the people, and this is exactly what we want to do. The government now will be able to do things in a very, very, they will not do with the kind of impunity that you could find in the last elections. And particularly the stoning of the parliament was something that they couldn't imagine. The mere fact that the government was dissolved, the cabinet was sacked, they had to compromise with Azimio and Raila Odinga. The mere fact that that was achieved is in itself a revolution. And we should be able to be happy about it. We should also be happy about it that if people now talk about an issue, let's say, for example, we are now talking about the elections to be stolen. If they find that we are talking about those elections to be stolen, and what goes around it could be a mobilizing force, you'll find them coming to listen to us. So we should always be happy that we have conquered some areas in terms of this struggle. We have conquered within the struggle of the new constitution. We have conquered in terms of new electoral processes. We have brought young people now into the plane, and they will continue being much more stronger because the hegemonic powers of, for example, the imperialist America has now been discontinued, and I think the war in Iraq, in spite of the myth, it has killed so many people and many have been displaced. But that, as it may be, it has shown that the mighty, the people that call themselves mighty, can be felled by the battle of organizing and the battle of resolve and the battle of commitment. And this is exactly what will happen going forward, even as we look for America to be able to shape the world. Sure.
Yeah, as I'm listening to you, I'm thinking about one of my favorite quotes by Lenin, that there are decades where nothing happens, and then there are weeks where decades happen. But I think that's usually misunderstood to mean that there's almost nothing happening in those decades where nothing is happening. But usually that's when you have, this organizing, mobilizing, political education, building and liberating sites of struggle, building coalitions and alliances, and such that when, in the week where the decades happen, what is visible is something that has been brewing for a very long time. And so, Wanjira, I think I want to reflect a little bit on some of the questions that are raised by what Njuki has said, because a lot of the energy that came from the streets is now being redirected to the ballot, and there's hope for a ballot revolution. First of all, what's the hope there? What is the ultimate outcome that those who are organizing towards it are hoping for? And what's the contingency plan, if that is not something that comes to be a reality? What's the plan for maintaining that momentum even after the election? And I mean, maybe this is a risky question to ask, but what are the chances we're even going to get to an election?
I like it. I like that question because the organizing towards a ballot revolution does not rule out a street revolution. June 25th is coming this year and next year. We are still very aggrieved. And IEBC is playing games. We have seen a lot of discrepancies with the voter registration process. a new person going to register would find that they have already been registered and probably they even voted in some place, which are things we are raising with IEBC, which is eventually going to lead to an ultimatum, which might lead to an actual, because we're still very aggrieved and angry. What we're trying to do is do it the constitutional way, right? Do it the legal way. And even among the team, there are those who feel very strongly that, guys, this is not an alternative. Elections will not bring any victory to us and to our cause. And there are those who, of course, feel like we have to try and do it the right way. It's the only way we gain legitimacy across the world, and we need to work with other international players as well. So it's a process that we are willing to go through. But again, I remind you that June 25th is coming this year and June 25th is coming next year, and we just don't know what might happen. Of course, there's organizing towards that. People will be on the streets. So what are we doing to ensure that the energy and momentum is kept? The fire has never left any one of us, as you can tell. I mean, even with the Tukokadi energy, it feels like we are on a Maandamano again. But we are also reflecting and saying we do not want to be the generation that was known for vibes and, just fun and hanging out and shouting and chanting down the system. So those are active conversations that we are having. And we are saying, let's actually do civic and political education, using the election as a major reason why we are doing civic and political education. So it's not just voting. It's also, I remind you that in 2024, young people and people of Kenya texted their members of parliament, implored their members of parliament to vote no to the finance bill. And members of parliament proceeded to vote yes to the finance bill, in fact, mocking young people and calling them crazy and da-da-da. So 2027 is a moment of revenge. And we are feeling like we just don't have the time to give these politicians. We are not 19, 18 anymore. We don't have the luxury of time. And we can see it. I think they cannot, how the curtain falls, like you can just see beyond the curtain. It's just very clear that their interests are not the interests of the country. They are foreign interests. And we, as a majority of the Kenyan people, are going to put our foot down, that this is what we are about this time. And I was sharing with my friend the other day that, how we always say the struggle is protracted? Maybe this is it. Hasn't it been protracted since 1963? Like, how much longer? Like, there's a huge population of people who are feeling like they cannot stomach this kind of leadership. Absolutely disgusted by the kind of leadership we have. And I think our work now as organizers is to just, I find it very easy in my head to take down a dictator. I just be like, can't guys just wake up one day and we go and tell him to get out? Like, can't we just build consensus as a people? Because we don't have time. We have the numbers. This is our country. We have a say in what goes and what doesn't. And that's what we're trying to build, a system that can both protect us, but also help us build a future that is beneficial to all of us. That is why tribelessness was a major thing during the Gen Z protest. It is projecting nationalism, which is what the elite politicians were trying to bury by pushing divisive tribal narratives. So the thing that gives me hope very much is that our generation really does not see anyone for their tribe. There's been a lot of intermarriages as well. In my family, I have all the tribes of this country. So we are just seeing ourselves as young patriotic Kenyans who cannot afford to risk our most productive years and our futures to these clueless, greedy, I almost said stupid politicians. Yeah.
Great. Okay, so I'll have one last question for Vincent, and then prepare your questions, audience. So this is something I've been thinking about for a little bit, about what does a liberation movement look like for an African country in today's world? Because the liberation movements that got us flag independence were operating in a very different environment. They were operating where the enemy was visible, especially in like settler colonies. They were operating in contexts where the nation state was the seat of power. That's not really the case anymore, with a lot of like finance capital and multinational corporations holding most of the power and really calling the shots in ways that have completely sort of like castrated the nation state as the holder of power. They were operating in conditions where the majority of young people were in places of work where they could organize. They were laborers and they could form labor unions. There was much greater labor union density. And for the peasants who were not employed in industry, they had something to lose, so it was also easier to organize them. But young people, especially in a country such as Kenya, young people have been totally lumpenized. They have been stripped of economic power to the point where they live in degrees of precarity that make it very difficult for them to organize. Like we say in the movement space, a lot of the people who we organize with can be bought with 500 bob because they need the 500 bob to eat. Now, it's really difficult to organize in that way. So we have so many things that are stacked against the young people of today that even those who had to struggle against the colonizers of then did not have. And so, to my mind, there is no liberating an African nation without liberating the continent. There's no liberating the continent without an internationalist, leftist, alliance that is pushing for the same thing at the same time. So, yet there has never been less left internationalism. I ask you this question because you have lived in very many places and have engaged in left-wing spaces across very many different countries. What is the state of left internationalism today? Sometimes I get very concerned. My colleague Christine and I listen to a lot of foreign podcasts, and sometimes it's crazy to hear how lefties at the core of empire are actually so blind to the fact that they live at the core of empire, and so their analysis can be very limited as well. So what is the hope in creating a true left internationalism? What is the state of the left? And what do you think about my proposition that there's no liberating Africa, there's no liberating any one country without liberating the entire continent?
Okay, that's a bunch of very good questions. First of all, I will say that I agree that internationalism is more necessary than ever at a moment which for now is more difficult than ever. I will absolutely agree that there is a real problem in the United States, especially with I won't even go as far as internationalism, but with comprehending that actually other countries exist. But again, luckily, I don't think that the United States needs to be the core or a part of necessarily a new movement for changing the world. The United States is a very powerful country, but it's one of many, and if we don't solve the problem of American-centric Americans, which I think it will take a very long time to solve, there are still many opportunities for internationalism. But before I go on to your bigger and better questions, I'll follow up on something that you've both said that I thought that really struck me, is that when you look at history, when you look at the classic big successful revolutions, in most of the cases, 5, 10, 15 years before that, there was an apparent failed revolution, right? You talk about Lenin in 1917, there's 1905 in Russia. In Cuba in 1959, well, Che Guevara's in Guatemala in the 40s. He watches the left decimated there. There is a movement of years that is defeated in Cuba. So often, the apparent initial defeat leads to a much bigger victory down the road. And actually, that's more the rule than the exception when we look at the classically successful capital R revolutions. Now, there hasn't been a revolution of that type for quite a long time, but it often historically has been the case that it is better to apparently not get what you want the first time in order to have the opportunity to regroup, replan, coordinate, and do something bigger and better the second time. At least historically, going across hundreds of years, that is one thing that has emerged. Now, I think that you are absolutely right about changing global circumstances. I would never presume to try to opine on what is necessary for the liberation of one or all nations of Africa. But what I will agree with you on is changing global systemic conditions. I do think that the nation and the state of an individual nation, while still an incredibly crucial terrain of struggle, cannot be the be-all and end-all. As you say, capital is elsewhere, control is elsewhere. Even if you were to put, let's say you imagine your perfect party in charge of this or that country, you're still going to be inserted into the global capitalist system. What has been characteristic of this system for 30 to 40 years, but that is changing very quickly, and like as you say, like in the last 24 hours, we got confirmation of what seemed quite clear over the last 3 or 4 weeks, which is that the United States was humiliated and defeated in Iran. Donald Trump thought that he could, in many ways, so Donald Trump over the last few months has been led by this belief that he somehow is able to squeeze more out of a system that the United States itself had created to replace the imperialist system that was already there with a more brutal and direct one. Now, there's 2 ways that you can explain this kind of a mad quest, which ultimately the Islamic Republic ended, I think, in Iran. One is psychological or ideological. He just thought that he could get more. He's dumb enough somebody told him that. But also this kind of a desperate attempt to seize more power out of a given situation is often characteristic of an attempt to stop an inevitable loss, right? So, look, if you get the national, if you look at this kind of a move that can be made in a national context, when a leader tries to seize more power to carry out a self-coup or a national coup, it's often because they realize their power is about to go away. And so I think the United States acting in this very mad and unpredictable way is characteristic of not only this ideological blindness about the rest of the world system that you've already pointed to, Mamka, but is systemic of a deeper material reality, which is that the United States is losing, not all, but a lot of the power that it had 20, 30 years ago and is acting out in a quite unpredictable way. Now, what we all hope, well, not everyone, but what I think a lot of us in this room might hope is that a weakened United States allows more space for experimentation and sovereignty at the national level, right? So the kinds of things that might get you very quickly invaded or couped or sanctioned in 2005 might hopefully be possible in 2035 if the United States is preoccupied with its own problems. But we still have a world system which is now really truly global, right? As you say, and I think this is a problem that we really must be confronted, is that the public sphere of almost every country in the world is no longer controlled by the national sovereign power, but it is owned by technology corporations in the United States. This is something that has to be dealt with, I think, in the long term. The internet is a set of material cables and computers, and they're owned by oligarchs in the United States of America that are using that to extract resources from every country in the world and to shape discourse in every country in the world. That is something that must be confronted. And another shift that I will agree with, and I think that nobody's come up with an answer to this problem, and people are trying, is that like the classic old romantic vision of the proletariat being thrown together in factories and being able to organize in those factories because they're shoulder to shoulder is not only not true anymore in the industrialized North Atlantic, it's definitely not true outside of the North Atlantic. And so the question of how to organize individualized precarious workers or to organize along other lines, organize as renters, as community members, as political citizens, is one that I think everybody is sort of working on. There's different attempts, you do see some movements which started as students transforming into political parties which take over the state. But again, I'm thinking of the case of Chile and Boric. So in 2011, you had a student protest movement, which got a lot of attention. It was it was inspiring, but it achieved concretely basically nothing. 2 years later, a couple of the student leaders entered Congress on small left political party platforms, did their best to somehow influence political reality in that country for a few years. And then there's another protest, a youth explosion in 2019. And the leaders of the 2011 protest win an election and become the government. But then being in charge of the state in Chile does not get you out of being in the semi-periphery in a neoliberal South America. They are ridden with contradictions, and they have a very hard time delivering a lot of their platforms. And even achieving state power did not solve the problem for them. So I will just end by saying that I agree with your analysis of two major problems, and that I hope that changing world systemic conditions as a result of my own country screwing up and shooting itself in the foot and destroying some of the power that it had accumulated for itself allows for a wider space for us to experiment with those two problems, or how to attack those two problems, which is how to organize in a changed work environment and how to create international connections in a world which is in which that is harder to do than ever. Now, what I will say finally is that the U.S. is very bad at this. I mean, the U.S. the DSA, like, U.S. left will try very hard, and they will love to talk about the global South or internationalism, but concretely, they really spend a lot of time thinking about the United States. But there are other parts of the world which are much more dedicated to this. As you know, I spent a lot of time in Brazil, and I was really surprised yesterday to find that the MST, the Landless Workers Movement from Brazil, had already established pretty deep connections here. They're very committed to this. They take it very seriously. And there are a lot of groups around the world which do take this very seriously. And not ironically, but even though the internet has been taken over by oligarchs which use it to extract wealth and shape public discourse, it has made it a little bit easier for South-South coordination of struggles in apparently very distinct countries which are confronting the same world systemic contradictions.
Great, thank you. And thank you to all our panelists. And I just remembered that I didn't actually introduce Wanjira. So Wanjiru is an activist par extraordinaire, and one of the founders of Mathare Social Justice Center, and the incoming MCA of Kosovo Hospital Ward in Mathare.
Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, and thank you for being with us this whole time. Yeah, well, you're the first to ask a question, and I know you have a book, because I was going to say the first person to ask a question gets a signed book. Okay, the two of you can come up so that you can, yeah.
Thank you so much for hosting this and putting this together. Congratulations, Vincent, on the book. I really enjoyed it. I just wanted to ask Wanjira, it seems like the progressive movement, not just in Kenya, but also in Uganda, Tanzania, you all seem to coalesce around the issue of anti-corruption, almost exclusively. And I feel like there's been such a lack of articulation around an economic program for the poorest people in this country. And it's made for some really kind of strange bedfellows in the movement of people that want to see change in this country. So, for example, one of the luminaries of the current moment is the former Chief Justice, Maraga. And I remember distinctly him coming into his position saying that, calling himself a conservative judge. Or in Tanzania, Tundu Lissu, whose solutions for Tanzania just sound a lot like a better version of neoliberalism. Or even in Uganda, like Bobi Wine has fled to, of all places, the United States to look for help. So I'm just wondering if there's any plan around offering kind of real concrete goods or program materialist things that you can that can be articulated for the poor, for the poorest people in this country, so that we're not just fighting against sending Ruto home, but actually we are for something. And I'm wondering, Vincent, if you've encountered any movement that is a lot like the one that's happening in Kenya, where there was a lack of a more substantial debate in that sense, and how the seeds for such a debate can be sown so that it can happen. I hope that makes sense.
All right. Thank you for that question. The fight against corruption is very much an economic fight because people are feeling like they are stealing our money that could have gone into healthcare, money that could have gone into education, money that could have gone into improving the living standards of the people. The kind of politics that we have been pushing as young people, as Gen Z, are issue-based politics. But then, when we look at the bigger picture of things, we understand that we have to connect all of those issue-based that we are talking about. For example, we have a lot of struggles, economic justice, feminism, all of these fronts that we are fighting that are not consolidated. So it is that realization that is forcing an organization of structures that can then birth a society of social justice. Every time you hear me speak, I will always talk about dignity and social justice, because those are the issues that affect the ordinary Mwananchi. But then there's also the historical injustices that must be addressed. I don't see corruption in issue-based politics as being different per se. It's just that, in fact, we are choosing not to call it corruption and just call it theft of public resources, which is our resources. Maybe the political education sessions that we are looking forward to having using the Tukokadi campaign. This Friday, we are going to be in Kitale and Siaya, establishing those contacts to conduct the political education sessions that are going to help us look at oppression holistically, not just as an issue, which is a challenge we have been having around among the people organizing, because everybody organizes towards their passion. If my passion is feminism, I will organize towards feminism. If my passion is environmental justice, I care so much about the environment, I will organize towards that. But the reality is all of our issues are interconnected, and until we build a united front, we are not going to win. So our efforts are now geared towards creating that consciousness of interconnectedness of issues so that we can build a united front. Don't know if that makes sense. On the question of Bobby Wine, there's this thing we always say that we need to, of course, it's a lack of political consciousness. There's no way the empire protects you from what it has created to eat you. But my friend likes to say that we need to organize in the world as is, as we organize towards the world as should be. So I think those are some of the things that we are seeing manifest here and there. And in terms of Maraga, I cannot say much about him, but he appeals to a huge number of Kenyan people who are anti-corruption. He's very clean on, like, his hallmark is rejecting corrupt money, which is something a lot of Kenyans vibe and associate with. But the conversation about a presidential candidate, again, is another conversation we are going to have, including me and you. We are going to ask ourselves, listen, can we build consensus? Because that's the thing we have not been able to do. We do not want to have 1, 2, 3, 4 people against Ruto. It must only be one candidate against Ruto. And it is not just Ruto, it is that system that has killed, stolen, oppressed, disregarded, disrespected Kenyans for decades. So that's what we are up against in 2027.
Yeah, just very briefly to follow up on the part of the question that was directed at me. What I found, again, huge, big picture analysis, is that when you have apparently spontaneous mass protests that concretely consist of lots of different people that came together very quickly with a lot of different reasons for being there, I find that anti-corruption tends to be the thing that rises to the top most quickly. And I think there's two reasons for that. I think there's one is that if you ask almost anybody in the global system today, do your elites represent you? Do you think that they are doing what they should to represent you? Almost everybody will say no. I'm not the only one to call this a crisis of representation. But also, if you ask somebody, are you for or against corruption? The question's already answered, right? In the question itself, corruption is already, it's built into the word. It's a negative word, right? Everyone's anti-corruption. What we saw in some of the cases that I looked at, Brazil is one that I looked at most closely, is that there are lots of ways to be anti-corruption. The anti-corruption struggle was one that was co-opted by the right in Brazil and used as an excuse to put Lula in jail. So I think that identifying this very real crisis of representation, this gap between what is supposed to be happening and what is really happening, the represented, or those who are supposed to be represented and those who are supposed to be representing them, but there's no representation happening, is at the core of what powers a lot of political mobilization globally, but a concrete positive, not positive in the sense of good, but concrete, a concrete plan for the particular way in which you're going to resolve the question of representation or rebuild representation or fight corruption ends up being incredibly important in later stages as well. But that's, I don't know anything about the domestic situation. I'm thinking a lot about Brazil.
Thank you so much for this event. I wanted to ask, because you talked about this alternative structures and alternative systems which are not there. So when governments get overthrown or there's so many people on the street, there's a lack of alternative structures or systems. And I was wondering what are the the core structures you see which are missing? You talked about civic spaces which are important, but also I wanted to ask if there are also other things you think are important to build. And then I was also wondering, because you also said we live in a system, so we have to use the system somehow until we can change it. And then I'm wondering, what do you think about invading already existing institutions until we are there, that we can actually have our own institutions and our own systems already built up? Because I have the feeling this is a long way to build them. And I'm wondering, do you think we can use the already, they are oppressive already, so I'm not sure. Do you think we can transform them in a media-term solution until we have our own structures? Does that make sense? Yeah? Okay.
I think it's the never-ending question of reform versus revolution. And maybe actually you're the best person to answer that question.
Yeah, one of the tragedies that we have experienced in this country is that that crescendo of anger for the people is always compromises by bringing the same leaders who are part of the problem. You might see as people who are clean and they mobilize the anger, but they are not different from the leaders that are there. And that's why it is very risky sometimes to focus on an individual and say this person who goes, another person, and these things will be fine. Those people who know the history of this country, they know even the same thing that was happening to Moi must go. The same slogan was there. Moi must go. But the people that we brought to take over Moi are the same people who were in the same system of Moi. It was Kibaki, actually, who was so many years Moi's deputy, Moi's person. And there was no serious fundamental break from the system that Moi has created. So even now, we will so much be able to say that we want a united front to be able to focus on Ruto must go and what is happening. But the person that will bring there will not be a single person, will be a team of people who believed in radical construction in this country. Agikoyo have got a saying they call Itueka. It's a breakaway. And generations have never said this movement of bringing new players, new people, new radical ideas. They always recycle the old politicians who were there before. I will not even name names, but I know we think of United Front, but we think the same people have been in the communist system for almost 30, 40 years. The people who have survived from this system? Will they bring any changes? We shall change him, yes, but who comes into it? But the other thing also is that because the left in this country has always been into going into politics, into protest as individuals. The left in this country has never gone as united front. But we are not saying that we have got capacity to be able to mobilize many Kenyans. But there are 4 principles that we hold very dear within the Kenya Left Alliance. The first principle is about socialism. We say that there must be a radical break from the system that was inherited from Kibaki, Kenyatta, and going over. It must be the system of people-centered. But the second thing that we talk about is Pan-Africanism. The Kwame Nkrumah, the Nyerere must come into play very strongly. And the third thing is feminism, because there has been systematic erasure and silencing and manipulation of women in the struggle for change globally. So feminism would be a strong one. But the fourth thing is anti-imperialism, because what's happening, for example, in Iran is an imperialism. It's that force that must be able to be strong. But those are the basic principles. But the basic clarion call that we talk very strongly is we must be able to hearken to people's needs through 3 key issues. One of them is land, the other one is liberation, and the other one is food. You go to so many people in this country, they are suffering without food. And not only about food, but what kind of food are people eating? So there must be an alternative that people project in the future. Before you give people hope of what is going in the future, you must be able to organize that future for now. But there is no way that we shall continue this country trying to reform the system. This system is unreformable. And those people who go to this system thinking that they will change, they will get ransom power, they'll go into state house, they'll get the same pecs from members of parliament, they will never change. There must be a creation of new people who are self-centered, who are selfless, people who are committed, a team that will be able to bring radical changes that we have never felt in this country. And if we lose this movement, for example, by compromises, by saying that let's have these people now taking over us, then this country will have what we call a cycle of repetition. You'll have another Kibaki, you'll have another Uhuru, you'll have another Ruto. So there must be a new young generation and vibrant generation of leaders that will emerge, and which are emerging, and we can see them, who people will give so much hope that this is a breakaway. What we are finding, for example, in Burkina Faso, in the Sahel states, with all the shortcomings once here and there, but it's a new region that is coming. We could see even what is, for example, happening with a new leader called Mahama in Ghana, declaring issues that other leaders are not doing, because he's not being guided, and he's not being guided by a strong socialist movement. The socialist movement of Ghana is a very strong part of the movement that you are fighting in Ghana. So there must be that kind of alternative, that even before people go to the streets and protest and bring regimes, there must be something that they are hoping for.
Yes, we have room for one final question. Okay, Sefu, because I haven't seen you all year, you get one question too.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Samuel Kisika. I'm a journalist and also an author of this political novel, exploring tribal politics in our universities. I see, Wanjira, you have said that 2027 is going to be a moment of revenge. Oh, sorry. Wanjira has said that 2027 is going to be a moment of revenge. But I'm so worried because the main problem in our politics is tribal mobilization. And if you have been so keen yesterday, it was so disappointing to see some Luo elders saying that all Nilotes should unite as we head to the 2027 election. So which means it's going to be like Nilots against Bantus and Gushades, such like groupings. So as you have said that 2027 is going to be a moment of revenge, how are you preparing to ensure that we overcome this problem of tribal groupings among the youths? And as journalists who has covered Kenya and parts of East Africa, South Sudan and Kenya has similar politics of tribal groupings. So that's why we see we have so many problems there. And the Gen Z protest, the contributor to its failure, that movement to fail, is because some youths who are at the forefront of this movement resorted to their tribal kingpins. You see someone like Kasmal went to Raila's side because he knows where he comes from, right? He's a tribal kingpin. There are those who went to Kalonzo, there are those who went to Rigiji. How are you preparing to ensure that we overcome this problem as we head to the elections?
Thank you. And I like that question, actually. This morning, I had a meeting with the TikTokers. And the discussion we were having was narrative control as young people. We know that the government has a budget for narrative control, 100 million set aside, to push a tribal narrative. So we have to plan a counter. We don't have a budget, but we can influence young people to push an anti-tribalism narrative. Because when we were on the streets, all tribes were being killed. Everybody went out for Albert Ojwang. Everybody went out for Julia, Njuki. I mean, it's very easy to deconstruct their tribalism because just recently they killed us indiscriminately, regardless of what tribe you are from. And today morning, someone said something that I think stayed with me. Someone said that the Luo people might be saying two-term right now, but they're the most difficult people to convince. They say that he killed Ojwang. How can we vote for him? And that's a narrative we want to ride on. So we are preparing to just, because it's the only thing in our power, to have power over what narrative is being driven everywhere on social media and on mainstream media. And I personally believe tribalism died in 2024. The tactic to say we are tribeless was very confusing to the political side because all they have known is to play tribal politics. Everybody aligns themselves as the Luo kingpin, Luya kingpin, Kamba kingpin, Kikuyu, and then these young people who are the majority come and say we're tribeless. So that's something we want to continue doing and showing how no matter what tribe you're from, when you go to the national hospital, the kind of treatment you receive are the same shitty treatment you receive, even if the president is from your tribe. So it's just to deconstruct tribalism in such a way that it makes sense to every single person. And then bringing back 2007-2008 post-election violence, we have not forgotten. I am a victim of post-election violence when my elder brother was killed by police and many other Kenyans. We are going to say no one is going to fight each other. It's a class. It's a horizontal violence for who and for what. Why should people fight? The only people that should be fought are the people that betrayed Kenyans. So from now to next year, you will see young people pushing sober politics, but then you will also see the counter of that because TikTokers and YouTubers are going to be paid to push mostly and majorly the tribal narrative because it really is the only card left for the politicians in the country.
Great, thanks. All right, Sefu, we'll take a question from you and then we will close.
Good evening. I have a question for each of the panelists here. So my question to Njuki, when you were speaking about the Mau Mau and the young people going to the street, you spoke about the fact that the young people we were saying that we are the new Mau Mau and we're here, and that this was a revolution. But my question to you is, the Mau Mau, even when they were in the forest, they had a revolutionary theory. It was not just the practice of them going to attack the white person. There's something that anchored them and led them. So can we really say that a revolution has happened without any revolutionary theory? And also, what is a revolution to that? Because you called 2024 a revolution, has there been any change, systemic or in any way? Bevins, my question to you is, what is the importance of a vanguard party or organization when it comes to mass mobilization? Can we say that if we are mobilizing masses, then if we are having like a mass mobilization, is that enough to take over power, or is there need of something more? So what is the importance of a vanguard? And to add on to that, is it possible for a mass mobilization to take over power without a vanguard?
All amazing questions, and it's sad that those are the final ones. But yes, please begin.
Thank you, comrade. I'm happy because Comrade Sefu is she is a comrade within the Kenya Development Alliance, and maybe she should be able to respond to those questions she's asking me, because she knows all of them very well, those questions. But the question about the Mau Mau is that there could be no revolution, yes, without a revolutionary theory. Even when you take power without a theory of how we structure that power, you will not be able to take that state power properly. But even Mau Mau itself, once it began from a level of spontaneity. People went to the forest, they were angry, people were being killed. And it is within the course of being in the forest, the Mau Mau themselves started organizing themselves of possibilities of taking over power. You remember Kimathi being installed like prime minister, the war council, the field marshal, because now they had possibilities of taking over power. One, they're in the forest. But even that process of them taking over power was not fulfilled, because what happened after that, the British government, the massacre, the betrayal, the assassination of Kimathi and many other people, and the people who took over power were the same people that were fighting against the Mau Mau, which they didn't believe it. So they didn't really take power, and this is the tragedy even today, that we don't have those leaders who fought for resistance, the struggle, take over power. But once the Gen Z was saying with the new Mau Mau, I think they were much more in terms of the spirit of the times. The stomping, the anger, the emerging, the movement forward. They could see themselves as the new Mau Mau. But the key thing that we should be able to learn is exactly why did the Mau Mau take over power. And there is no power which is taken, and there is nothing which is organized without a reflection of where have we come from, of what has happened in the past. I think it's Bomal who say in this great future we must not forget where we are coming from. What the mistake of revolution is to think that we are new, we are fresh, this thing has never been done before. These are mistakes sometimes revolutions go into, and we fall into holes, the same holes that we got into. So the same thing that we are saying the Mau Mau should be a deeper reflection exactly why the Mau Mau didn't take over power and what should we do to take over power. But the only thing we have taken off is questions of land, liberation, and food, which is the Mau Mau. How we structure that is upon us. But the second question for Sefu is about the revolution. And there's a whole lot of academic ideas about the meaning of revolution. And I've said there are two really good concepts. One of them is about the structural, the systemic change, but also there is the other aspect, which is a process of revolution. A revolution doesn't end. There's no final idea of a revolution. That's why you see, even in Cuba, it's called the revolution continues. When you see in fact in Tanzania, they used to call themselves at this time Chama cha Mapinduzi. It's the part of the revolution. It doesn't end. So, but to me, when I was calling it a revolution, the Gen Z revolution, is I could see a lot of hope in terms of young people who some of us thought are political, that they will not be able to rise, that they were so much downcast by survival issues. They're not able to survive and to rise. But you could see this mass of people who rose all at the same time. And why I call it revolution, there was no structural revolution. But the mere fact that they were able to to bring down senses of impunity in this country. And I said initially that the government is now so scared of people rising again like what they did in June 24. The same thing, that is why I call it a certain element of revolution, that people are able to rise and people are able to inspire other people elsewhere. We inspired Uganda, we inspired many other people. And to me, that is what we might call a revolution. But we must continuously be able to stick to what kind of society do we want to build going forward. And I would ask if any of you would like to know more about the Kenya Left Alliance, you can see all of us, you can see Seth, you can see many of us here. We shall tell you much more about what we are trying to create and the front we are trying to create of the Kenyan left. Thank you very much.
Okay, great. Two great and very ideologically coherent questions about the vanguard. So there's a Brazilian philosopher, Rodrigo Nunes, who I really like to cite on this question. He's in the end of the book. He would be great for your podcast at some point. And he talks about vanguard function as something that can be distinct from the identity or the self-proclaimed vanguard status. And what this means is that you can have a mass of people, you can have 100 million people in the streets that are claiming to be leaderless and structurelessness. And the fact that they're saying that does not stop some kind of structure from being imposed. It does not stop some actual leadership from emerging, even if those people reject the title of leader. And there's a very famous essay called The Tyranny of Structurelessness that point to a perverse phenomenon in which a movement which pretends that it has no structure, pretends that it has no leaders, often can produce some of the most tyrannical types of leadership, because there is no mechanism for choosing who actually is the leader, and because there is no recognition that there is some kind of a vanguard or some kind of a leadership, there's no means to contest this. At the same time, you can declare yourself a vanguard. You can say, we're a vanguard party. You can say, I'm the vanguard. Follow me. But if I walk out that door and no one follows me, I'm not the vanguard. I'm just a guy wandering around, right? I can say that I'm a vanguard, but if there's no one actually behind me, it's just in my head, right? And so what you find, which gets me to your second question, which I said is very ideologically coherent. Historically speaking, has there ever been a situation in which the masses, as masses, take power? No. Somehow or another, whether or not this is a group which has been formed with the ideological project of being a vanguard party or a vanguard movement that is prepared to take power, in many cases, these are famous cases, that has been the case, or in other cases where it is some other group that steps forward in the name of the rest of the masses and takes power. Whether or not they call themselves a vanguard, I would say that concretely that they are a vanguard in some sense, right? Because this has been the dream of sort of left libertarian anarcho utopian visions of revolution, and maybe it could happen in the future. I'm kind of skeptical, but hey, anything could happen. The dream is that actually the masses become the new state, that somehow the old state disappears and then the masses self-organize into an entirely new system in which that is the new set of social relations, rather than some group entering the power vacuum that is opened up by the dissolution of the old state. I think in a world of imperialism, this is even more difficult to imagine, because when there is a power vacuum, if there is not some group in the national context which is ready and willing to fill it, imperialist powers will find that it is in their best interest to do so for them. So I would say that whether or not this groups have been telling themselves that they are preparing as a vanguard or not, usually, if you think about what it actually means, just to simply vanguard means to be in front, to go forward, and to be followed. It is always somebody that is a small percentage of the actual number of people on the streets that end up exercising power in the medium term. And as I found in the case of this book, at least, it tends to be people that are well organized and capable of truly collective action, that are best positioned to take advantage of these opportunities. People that are organized already in advance and are capable of acting quickly in a truly collective way, whether or not these are left-wing, right-wing, military, civil society, foreign. These groups tend to be the ones that enter the power vacuum, And whether they like that word or not, I think that is some kind of vanguardism. But the ones that win in these battles tend to be prepared, and I think, as you demonstrated in your questions, that you are yourself quite ideologically coherent in their understanding of what they want to change if given the opportunity.
Great, thank you so much. I think we have to leave now because I think we have made, unfortunately we really can't, I'm sorry. We have actually asked the library to stay open much longer than they usually do. But a huge thank you to all of you who have sat here so patiently listening to us and engaging with this conversation. It has really been wonderful. A huge thank you to Njuki, to Vincent, to Wanjira for a wonderful conversation as well. And please follow us. This is going to be an episode on a certain amount of madness. Follow us on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Playlists, Apple Podcasts, and on X at A Madness Pod. And a shout out to Vincent, who has started a newsletter called North South Notes. And you can look for it on X and subscribe. It's free and you can receive, do you want to say something about it?
Well, it's not an X, but yeah, just northsouthnotes.org. It's similar to the kind of project you described a second ago. It's an attempt to build one more tiny little publication that connects different people from around the world. So I'd love to have more Kenyans subscribe to it. It's just, it's northsouthnotes.org. I would love to have, everyone's invited to subscribe.
Everybody here subscribe before you leave. And a shout out to Calotropis Radio, who are going to play this episode as part of their programming, as their regular programming. Ukombozi Library and Macmillan Library, who always work together to give us an amazing experience here. And Madari Social Justice, who, of course, are at the vanguard of the struggle. And thank you to all of you. And subscribe to our podcast. And we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.